Hello, everybody. I really hope that you can hear me right now. You might not be able to, and that would really suck because then I would have to start this all over and totally delete it. Um, no one is here right now. That will probably soon change because I am totally set for this. I have some waffles, I have a water bottle, and I have my phone, and I have the counter. So this is happening. I'm not saying that I'm happy that it's happening, but it is. You know, it's happening. That's the count up button. I don't know why I'm doing this, but as you know, or probably know, I currently have 44 subscribers. Now, that may not sound like not a lot, but we are now at the next multiple of 11. And in my previous video, thanks, I talked about why that's so important. So I said it's not important. Um, but yeah, whatever. Is that my volume? I think that's the volume. Um, so we're gonna do this. We're 2 minutes in. I haven't really started yet. But yeah, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It's already getting difficult. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 50. Also, I forgot to mention, please comment down below which one of the subscribes got you. This is such a stupid idea because there's still no one watching, and I'm still gonna do it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It sounds like it's not a word anymore. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 101. Now I really want someone to be watching. So I'm going to text someone. And I know I shouldn't do this in live streams. But screw it. Texting people to come and watch. Because no one's here. Okay, I texted like 4 people. Probably going to get one of them to come. I've already been doing this for 5 minutes. Are you kidding me? That's insane. This isn't good. This is not good. But whatever. Let's keep going. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I might die. I'm only on 207 minutes, and I set my sights on 10,000. One person's watching. That's good enough for me. Yeah. Eventually. Eventually I will. Just hopefully not in this live stream. Hopefully I won't die. Gonna get to 300. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh, it doesn't sound like a word at all, man. It's weird. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 scub, scub. I said scub. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It just sounds weird to me now. In any time you say a word this often, like over and over and over, it just sounds so weird. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I got that one. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 300. Can you, the one person who's in the chat, can you actually hear me? Because I'm doing this on my laptop since you now have to have 1,000 subscribers in order to actually live stream. You can hear me. Okay. I just didn't know if the microphone was like really bad. This is insane. I'm at 10 minutes. That's okay. Jump to 500. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe counts. Subscribe. Why is it not counting? Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribers. It just sounds weird, man. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. There aren't. Dang it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hi, Cody. I thought you were Mitch for some reason. So I just can't tell sometimes. I don't know why you're watching this. I mean, I figured you'd come in and be like, "Oh my gosh, he's really doing it. I don't think it'll last that long," and then you'd leave and then come back like 2 hours later and be like, "Oh my gosh, he's on 10. He's on 8,000, whatever." Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I didn't count that. Why? Why am I doing this? Also, I hate that there's a typo in the title. Can I change that? Somehow? I cannot. Hey, Cody, can you like the video? Just can you like it, please? Please, maybe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. There's 2 people watching now. Hello to the second person. Did you subscribe? Shoves a full waffle down throat. This is so stupid. I don't know why I would do this. I really don't. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Say it right. I want to say them all right. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I have 1 like. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. That's embarrassing. Subscribe. Goodness. Hey, I got 3 people watching now. Dude, I'm practically PewDiePie. This waffle is stuck to the plate. I have 3 people watching. Dude, this is cool. What's annoying is that I know for a fact that 2 of them are my subscribers. So this isn't really helping at all. Unless that other guy... Oh, well, congratulations to your cousins. Unless that other guy isn't a subscriber, then maybe I'll eventually get him. Okay. I'm not going to talk again until I get to 1,000. And I'm at 700 right now. Subscribe, 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 Did I do an extra one? Subscribe. Might as well. Do 10,001. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't know if they count. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I did 2 there, and it didn't move, so I'm allowed to click that one more time. That's what I did, okay? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. What? It won't count up. What? It's not counting. Oh, now it is. Well, why did it do that? Subscribe? No, subscribe. Now I've said it 2 more times. It ain't counting. It isn't counting. What? I'm relying on you. No. So 805, since I said it 2 more times after that. Gonna have to find a different one and set it to 805. No. No. I didn't expect that to happen. Okay, so this one I can set a start value. I'm gonna put in 805 set. Okay, let's continue going through 805 to 1,000 till I take another break. I guess that was kind of a break, so that doesn't make any sense. Subscribe. What? Why does it not work again? Subscribe. Subscribe. Why is it not working again? This is disappointing. I want to do this, and now none of them are working. Dude, what am I supposed to do? Okay, now this one's working again. Ah, dude. I thought that was really bad for a second. Whew. 4 people. Oh, back to 3 people. I was gonna be like, hello, 4th person, but they're gone. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Said it twice. Nothing happened. It's okay. I'm not cheating. I want to be very particular about this. And I know there's going to be one part where I click it an extra time, or I don't click it, or something. Someone's going to screen record it and send it to me and be like, "You missed one," or "Oh, you only counted 9,999." And I'm going to be like, "Screw you. Subscribe." Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh yeah, look at that, we're at 1,000. Oh crap, I don't need to highlight that. 1,000. 1,000! Look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that, look at that. Ah. Shut up. Shut up, okay? Once you say it 1,000 times, it doesn't sound like a word at all. So it might sound a little like blah. I hope it doesn't, though. Now I'm just gonna take a little break and eat my waffle. Oh. I have a feeling this is going to be unhelpful to my channel. So I don't know why I'm doing it. Hi, Maddie C. I have no idea why I'm doing this. And I also don't know if I know who you are. But if you've subscribed, count, then great. If I gain 1 subscriber through this, it will have been worth it. Okay, let's continue. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Goodness. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 1, 1, 1, 1. Perfect. I'm at 30 minutes. That means I'll be doing this for 300 minutes if I go at a rate of 1,000 every 30 minutes. Oh my gosh. Also, if all of you, I say all of you watching, there's only 3, could somehow get other people to watch, then it's more likely for people who have never seen this channel to watch it, and maybe they'll subscribe, you know? They'll see this when I'm pleading for them to subscribe, and they'll look at my other videos and be like, hey, I like this guy, I'm gonna subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hello, fourth person has left. Back down to 3, but Banana is here. Knew he'd show up eventually. But yeah, this is going okay. 2 likes, 3 viewers. It's pretty great. 1,200 subscribes. Just saying, guys. Also, I know that there's a typo. I already know that there's a typo in the title. And I will fix that once the entire stream is uploaded, which will probably take around about 7 days. Oh, I do not want to reset that. Oh, I almost clicked reset. That would have been terrible, wouldn't it? Okay, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Don't want to do that. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay. I'm unsubscribing. See, the word subscribe is in unsubscribe, so I'm allowed to touch the subscribe counter. But come on now, Blackout 300. There's 4 people watching now. And half of them like it, apparently. I don't know why. This is great, though. I mean, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Goodness, you read the counter. I can see the counter. I'm at 1,333 subscribes. What you guys are talking about? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, half like it. Half. It says 4 people are watching and 2 people are liking. That's half. Done with this plate. My room's all clean now. But it's 1 like, 1 dislike. Oh, I didn't know that. It just says like. It just has a thumb. It doesn't have a thumbs down. I have a headache already. That's not good. No, don't. Don't text me. 5 people. Hi, 5 people. Or I say hi, 5th person. Subscribe, please. 5th person. If you could just go down and click the subscribe button. Do not unsubscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 1 person left. Darn. Back down to 4. So my top is 5 right now. That's my high score. Just one heck of a guy. Still haven't repped the thumbs up. Thumbs up. Repping, y'all. I don't know what that means. What do you mean by repped it? Repeated it? It's 2? It's 2. I repeated it. Now it's 3. Oh my gosh. Aw, I'm a thumbs up. See, what do you mean by that? Is that all it was? Repping it? Just saying 3 out of 4 people like it? Represent. Oh, my screen it's here. But it's not there for your screen. It's down there. You know what else is down there? the subscribe button. You should click it, dude. Oh, I'm down to 3. I'm down to 3, dude. I mean, I'm so happy there's 3 people here, but it was 5. It was 5. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Or Raji. Subscribe. Let's have an Araji, guys. Computer. Set volume to 7. Computer, what does Araji mean?
Here's what I found on Wikipedia. It is said that the lotus flower, though it grows in muddy water, doesn't accumulate the mud particles onto it. Such is the quality described as Raji. Today, in several Indian languages, including Hindi, Telugu, Bengali, Madheshi, Assamese, Marathi, and Kannada, Rajiv is the word for lotus flower.
A lotus flower. That's what I got from that whole thing. It's a lotus flower, guys. But my Mac battery is running low. That's really bad. Like, really, really bad. I need to plug it in. I'm going to move you all over here. Better anyway, because then there's more light. Oh, a 4th person is back. I had to move my laptop because it needs charge. Oh, the 4th person left. They left. Well, aren't they missing out on some exciting content? What do you guys have against my upload schedule? What? Stop complaining. I have like 36 videos. Come on, it's pretty great, huh? 4 people watching again. Hey, 4th person, why do you keep going out and back in? It's kind of weird. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hi, 5th person. Down to 3. 2 people left immediately. No. Then what does it mean, Blackout 300L? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 2 people watching. Oh no. It's going so far down. I had 5, now I have 2. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back up to 3. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh yeah. Meow YT or Mitch is going to a wedding. Hi, fourth person. If you're going to a wedding, you should tell everybody there to subscribe. Shouldn't you? Isn't that a great idea? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Missed one there. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I just said scribe that time. Sub. See, works. Eat with the people. Okay, great. You eat with those people from the wedding. And while you're eating with them, tell them to subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh, 5 people. I'm back up to 5. This is great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 6 people! Oh my gosh, 6 people are watching. Hopefully 6 people are subscribing. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 2,000. That is 2 whole thousand right there. Oh yeah. And it's almost at 50 minutes. So that means the first 1,000 took me 30 and the second one took me 20. There may be hope for me. There may be hope for me. Now I just have to do what I just did 5 more times. 8,000 left. This is kind of crazy. I don't know why I'm doing this, and I don't know why any of you are watching this, or for that much liking it. Half of you. 6 watching, 3 liking. So how can you even enjoy this? This is just supposed to. I think he probably did. Mr. Beast does everything better. I think. I just the whole idea of this is to just get people to come and be like, I wonder if he's actually doing it, and then they'll see, oh my gosh, he's actually doing it, and then they'll watch the other videos maybe, and then they'll subscribe. Subscribe. I didn't click it 3 times. Oh, subscribe. I was getting a little shaky there, but I think I got the count right. Ugh. It's a bad idea. What is this full screen? Will that work? I'm too scared to click it. I don't want to try. Subscribe. I don't know what you guys are talking about in the chat. Some sort of Pokemon, and I am confuzzled. Ooh, I know there's a way to get information on screen, like a live sub counter, a counter, or something. Now we're back down to 5. But we were up to 6. Maybe the person just left to go watch some of my videos because they want to subscribe. Maybe that could be it, couldn't it? Maybe not. Subscribe. Subscribe. Computer, how do you say subscribe in Spanish?
Subscribe in Spanish is suscribir.
Suscribe. I don't think that's what she actually said. It's hard to tell what my computer is saying. I was up to 6 again for a second. Now I went down to 5 and now down to 4. That's great. Subscribe. Back up to 5. Subscribe. Hello, 5th person. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My computer's really hot. Oh, 6 people. Hello, 6th person. You're great.
I don't know
Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh yeah. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Gosh, this is. I really, really hope that my laptop doesn't die because I have to do it on my laptop because you can't do it on a mobile thing like the iPad, which I usually do it on, unless you have 1,000 subscribers, which is the reason I'm doing this. So I want to get to that so that I can use this again. That's not the only reason. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. And for you to subscribe is the other reason. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. 6 people watching. Hello, 6th person. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. The chat is doing its totally own thing right now. Oh my gosh. My whiteboard's blank, as you can see. It's blank right now. No one else understands that other than the one guy in the chat. Subscribe, 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 subscribe back at 5. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 1 hour has passed now. Been having grand time. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Said that one good. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It's getting harder and harder, dude, because it doesn't sound like a word anymore. It's weird. It comes out strange, and you feel like you're not saying it right, but you are most of the time. So I got it wrong a couple times. I have some family members over. Okay. I'm ready to continue along this stupid journey. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 2,800. What are you even doing in the chat, Mitch? No one else is chatting. You're what? Whatever. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Got it, okay? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh, 3,000. 7,000 to go. Now, I don't know why Mitch is the only one typing in the chat when there's supposedly 5 people watching. They all must have better things to do and then are just letting this play in the background because they pity me. But whatever. That's okay. It's trying to now remind me tomorrow. I'm gonna do something that's not that smart. I'm gonna be right back, and I hope that none of you leave, but most of you probably will. But it'll just be a sec. Okay, bye. Oh my gosh, nobody left. I can't believe nobody left. That's kind of insane, but I'm at 3,000. I'm gonna keep on going. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My dog is not in here, but he is totally gone. He would have been more exciting to watch sleep. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Goodness. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hi, sixth person. There are 6 people watching. Hello. That's great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please, sixth person, would you just subscribe? Now I can't even say words that aren't subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Well, goodbye, Mitch. If you're actually leaving. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Everyone has their problem. Just get off. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Hello, Alex4. Could you please subscribe, 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 subscribe. I have a lot of problems. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It'd be great if I got subscribe, 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 Subscribe. Getting it wrong over and over, it seems. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back down to 5. That's probably Mitch who's left. Ow. My hand is climbing up just because I've clicked this so many times. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. Back up to 6 people watching. Hello, 6. Oh, my iPad is falling apart. Goodness gracious. I'm sorry. Okay. There it is, I guess. Rezk, what did he ask us to do? Let me tell you, I'm asking you to subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please subscribe. I make videos that are funnier than this. I don't like that I did this. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'll just repeat it another 7,000 times, or 6,469 times. Subscribe, 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 like, comment, share, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. At this point, I don't even care about notifications. I mean, great if you turn them on, then you're more likely to watch whatever videos I upload. But really, I just want you to subscribe. Subscribe. 3,700. It's pretty great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. What happens? What happens when I reach 10,000 subscribes? Then I end it. Didn't see that one coming, did you? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. And I hope they have a few more subscribers by that time. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Back down to 4 people watching. There we go. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It would be. And I think that by the end of 10,000, I might have one. I just might. And for those of you who can't see the chat right now, for whatever reason, that's what I'm reading and responding to. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. I know, I've gotten close to clicking the reset button a couple times and it was terrifying. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I said it right. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Let me turn it down even more. No, I'm not. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 6 people watching. Hello, 6th person. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please, please subscribe, 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 subscribe. I really don't know how I can ask more desperately or any more clearly. Please subscribe. That's all I want you to do. And I promise I make videos that are funnier than this. Because this is extremely boring. All this is supposed to do is supposed to get people to click on it. Be like, oh my gosh, he's actually trying to say subscribe 10,000 times. And then they'll look at my other video and be like, oh, these videos are actually funny. I'm gonna subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Rezk, you're funny. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh! Oh! 4,000! Don't have enough hands to have that many fingers. That's a weird way to put it, Stockton. I'm at 1 hour and 23 minutes. You've got to be kidding me. Why am I doing this? I don't know. Also, all my fingers hurt because I've been holding up the iPad and clicking it that many times. I've been clicking it 4,000 times every time I say subscribe. What is my subscriber count now? I can't see it on my screen anymore. It was like 44. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It was 44 when I started this. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It's probably still 44, and that's going to be really disappointing. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Yeah, I know. It's a great layout. It's so great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Well, it is a good light at nighttime. I'm not sure why I turned it on now. Great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. I'm ready for your question. Just subscribe, subscribe, subscribe already. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Dogs. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I have 2 dogs. I like dogs. Subscribe, subscribe. Small dogs. Very small dogs. Subscribe, subscribe. I don't have 2 small ones. I like very small ones. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I was expecting something deep and profound. You're like, there's no really correct answer. And I'm like, yeah, there is. Dogs. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ow. Oh, my thumb actually feels like I ripped a muscle through it. Ow. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please. I mean, gosh. Come on. Please. Please subscribe. It's all I want you to do. Just subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Thank you for subscribing. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. There's an actual reason why the sky is blue. Computer, why is the sky blue? Computer, why is the sky blue?
The sky is blue because the molecules of the atmosphere scatter blue light more than other colors. So when you look away from the sun, more blue is not that close into your eyes.
Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Is blue because blue is reflectable easier by oxygen, by the atmosphere. It's really all the colors. It's just there's more blue than all the other ones, so that's what your eye decides to see. Rhinos are just fat unicorns. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My window is open. I wonder if they can hear me. I hope they get the message. Subscribe, 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 people. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Down to 4 people, but I don't really care. If you subscribed before you left, then that's great, because all I want you to do is subscribe. And now I'm at 44. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I'm back up to 5. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Look at that. 444, baby. Oh, why am I doing this? I'm not even halfway. That's been an hour and a half. Whoever's watching right now, if you can, get another person to watch. Somewhere, somehow. I need more accounts watching this so that other people like RezK, who I do not know, can find my channel and see that I'm doing this stupid thing, watch my other videos and say, oh, I'm gonna subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I will feel, eventually I'll feel accomplished. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back down to 4 people. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Rate the dead. This is dedication. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna be dedicated. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. And yes, my throat is sore. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 4,600. Dude, 4,600. Ow. I want a nap. Oh my gosh, why am I doing this though? There's not a reason. It's just a bad freaking idea. Oh. I'm going to get into a more comfortable position. Subscribe, subscribe. That looks weird. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Well, if Cody is still watching, then he's been watching since 100. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Who has been here? I know no one was here at the very beginning because I could see how many people are watching this. But subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I wonder who's been here the longest. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Me. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Come on, guys. Don't just leave Rez K alone in the chat. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. The very good use. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Thank you for being subscribed. Thank you for subscribing. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 3 people watching. It's going down. I hit my peak, guys. Subscribe, subscribe. 4 people watching. Never mind. Going back up. Man, those numbers are crazy. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. You know what's funny? 4 people currently watching the live stream. More than PewDiePie, because he's not live streaming right now. So, basically I'm better than PewDiePie. No, I'm kidding, I'm not. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I will not go anywhere. I will be here saying subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back down to 3 people. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 5. Oh my gosh. 5,000. I'm halfway. Yay. Computer, give me an encouraging quote.
Sorry, I'm not sure.
There's no encouraging quote. Computer, what's an encouraging quote?
I'm not sure.
There's no encouraging quote. Never mind then. Whatever. I don't need encouragement. I can do this. I only got 5,000 more to go. Subscribe. I don't know how I can be more clear. Just please subscribe. Subscribe. Oh my gosh. Subscribe. Saw that one really weird. Subscribe. Readjusting again. What if that? No, that is not gonna work. I have to lift it up. Subscribe. Ugh. Subscribe. Oh my gosh. Fourth person, if you're here, hi. 5,300. I don't know why I'm doing this. It was a bad idea. I'm at an hour and 45 minutes. And I'm halfway. I'm just over halfway. 5 people are here now. Well, hello again, 5th person. 5,300 times I have said subscribe. So, if I can't be any clearer, I just can't. I can't. I mean, come on, just please subscribe. That's all this is. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I know it's great. It's so great. It's amazingly great. It's the greatest thing ever. Just subscribe and it'll be greater. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, I mean. Goodness. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please do that. Please do that, because the more people who watch, the more people, I mean, it's easier for it to get in recommended things, and the people will see it and they'll be like, yeah, yes, it's live, I want to watch it. And then they'll be like, is he actually saying subscribe 10,000 times? Oh my gosh, he is saying subscribe 10,000 times. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to subscribe, because I see some of his other videos right here on his channel. And they're funny, so therefore I will subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh, 5,400. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It worked. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back down to 4 people. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 3 people liking, 4 people watching. 3 people watching, 3 people watching. 4th person left. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I did hit 6 at one point. That was pretty cool. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 4 people liking, 3 people watching. I don't know how that's possible. This is pretty great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Please, I really don't want my laptop to die. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Look at that. 5. Back up to 4 people watching. Isn't that funny? Since I have 5, and there's 4 people watching. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. If only there was. It'd be really cool if there were 4 people. If there were 5 people watching, 5 people liking. 5. But I just ruined it by saying subscribe, 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 subscribe. If you can't guess what I want you to do by now, I want you to subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 5 people watching, 4 people liking. This is good. You know what I want you to do, 5th person? I want you to subscribe, 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 subscribe. This live stream is only to get people to look at it to say, is he really saying subscribe that many times? Oh my gosh, he is saying subscribe that many times. 5 people liking, 5 people watching. This is amazing. And then once they know I am saying subscribe that many times, they will look at my other videos and they'll be like, oh my gosh, this guy's actually funny. He's not just boring. It says subscribe 10,000 times all the time. He does funny things. I hope you think that. And then you decide to subscribe. Will I be able to rewatch it? Yes, probably. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 5 people watching, subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. 4 people watching, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 5 people watching, subscribe, 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 subscribe. I know about the title, okay? I understand the title is missing quotation marks, okay? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. And once it is uploaded, I will change the title. Subscribe, 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 so that it's correct. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Yes. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. That went up twice. That was weird. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It is so much stress. It really is a lot of stress. And I couldn't get my computer to give me an encouraging quote. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. That's actually really funny. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Yeah, that's actually when I get back to school and the teacher's like, what did you do this week? And I'm like, I said subscribe 10,000 times. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. And I gained 1 subscriber. I hope I gained more than that. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I actually can't see my live subscriber count. So I know I had 45 subscribers when this started, but I might have more. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Or I had 44, I mean. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Yeah, what's your question? I'm striving for something better than just saying subscribe, subscribe. Am I subscribed? Well, I am subscribed on a different account because I have 2 accounts. One for my school and one for this one. So on that one I subscribed. But on this account that you're watching the channel on, no, I can't subscribe. I would if I could. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. So yeah, I am one of my subscribers. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 5 people watching. Hello, 5th person. Are you ready to subscribe? Please subscribe. All I want you to do is subscribe and become a new subscriber. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. And I promise that I make more interesting videos than this one where I just say subscribe. Some are actually funny. No real reason why. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Yeah, sometimes spiders can even get prosthetics. Spiders are great. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. There's even a couple spiders subscribe to my channel. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I don't know what I'm talking about at this point. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I think they probably could. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Not as well as one with 8 legs, but subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 6 people watching. Hello, 6th person. Will you subscribe, subscribe? I said both of those. Will you please subscribe, 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 subscribe? 6,000, 4,000 more to go. I'm just barely more than halfway. This is insane. Please subscribe. And please know that I make more interesting and hopefully funnier videos than this, where I'm just saying subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I don't know if they do. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hello, number 6. I have 6 people watching. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Yay, you got someone to subscribe. That's so good. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. I just realized you guys can barely see that. I'm going to readjust again. How well this has worked. Yeah, I actually know for a fact about 2 new subscribers then. Which is great. And there's 6 people watching. I hope they're all subscribed. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. I really like this Rez K guy. He's funny. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. So we're definitely having a party when we hit 10,000 likes because I don't want to miss it. Don't worry, guys. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. We're going to get to it. 7! Hi, 7th person watching. Will you please subscribe? Just please subscribe. Please be a new subscriber. That's all I want. I promise I make more interesting and funny videos than this. This is really boring to both me and you. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 8 people. Oh my gosh. That's back to 7. I hit 8 for a second there. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Just 4,000 more. You got that. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I wish it was. I wish it was. Please share it with somebody. Don't care who. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please do that. Please tweet it to him because I'm sure he would enjoy it. I'm sure he'd have a great time watching me say subscribe. Back down to 6, but hey, I hit 8 for a second. That's a win in my book. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back up to 7. Subscribe. Back down to 6. Subscribe, subscribe. It's getting confusing. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please, please subscribe. All I want you to do is subscribe. I am bored out of my mind. Not to get deep, but there's people out there that can't subscribe, and you can't. So just please do as he says and subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Come on, guys. There's kids starving in Africa who just can't subscribe. Can you please subscribe to them? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I have nothing against people starving in Africa. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. Oh, we passed 2 hours. 2 hours of doing this. Come on. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. And believe it or not, I have better content. I have videos that are actually funny and not boring and just me saying subscribe about 1 million times. 1 million, I mean 10,000, and there's 7 people watching. Please, please, for the love of God, 7th person subscribe. Never mind, we're back at 5 people who I hope and pray that they are all subscribed. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my goodness, subscribe, subscribe. My goodness, why? Subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I hope I didn't miss too many subscribes there. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I really, really, really want you to subscribe to me. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 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 Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Whoo! Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Back down to 4 people. 4 people like it. 4 people are watching. That's okay in my book. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I am going insane. Subscribe, insane. Subscribe, subscribe, insanity. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay, I'm done. No, I'm not subscribed. There it is. There it is. We all knew it would come. There it is. I'm angry at myself for doing this. Just subscribe. Just please do it. That's all I'm asking for. That's all I want. I want you to subscribe. Christmas would come early if you just subscribed. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this, and I'm going a little insane. I didn't think I'd be able to do this, but I really want to now. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 5 people watching. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Please just subscribe. Now it's only 4. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I said that weird. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh. I don't know if this is the world record. I actually do not know. Computer, what's the world record for most times to say subscribe?
You have TubeBuddy enabled. Do you want to open it?
No. What? That's not what I asked. That'd be cool if I got a world record for this. Oh my god, my back hurts. Because I've been hunching over my computer. Just saying subscribe that many times. I have 3,000 more. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh, Stockton, what are you doing, man? What are you doing? My wrist hurts so bad. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please, fifth person who just showed up, subscribe. Oh, he left already. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. I hope he got the message. Oh my gosh. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'm just gonna point it down lower just so that I don't have to raise this up as much. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Not that much lower, actually. I want you to be able to see me. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. I said it twice and it didn't count, so I'm allowed to click those. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Computer, Simon says subscribe.
Subscribe.
Computer, Simon says subscribe to Stockton Laker on YouTube.
Subscribe to Stockton Laker on YouTube.
Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please, I make more interesting videos than this. Just, I promise. Please subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Hello there. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I said subscribe. 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 Only clicked it once there. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. What? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe. It's doing it again. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. See, why is it doing that again? I really don't want you to do that, man. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. It's not, it's counting weird. It's the second time. It first did it when I was around like 1,000. What was I saying? I don't know. I'm going nuts. I'm actually going nuts. Subscribe. See, why is it doing that? Subscribe, subscribe. Okay, 7,860. 7,860. 7,860. Computer. Computer. Remember 7,860.
Can you tell me all the details? For example, You can say remember that Susan's shoe size is 8.
$7,860. I'm looking for another online counter. I don't want to do that. Well, oh, I just went right back into this one and it's saved. Will it work? Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Yes, it does. See? Oh my gosh, my back though. Like actually, my back is aching from sitting in this position. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Why am I doing this? Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Didn't count one of those. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Didn't count one. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. See, it's not counting some. Like I have to hold it down longer now. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Buddy, you can't come in until you subscribe. Buddy's my dog. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 8,000. Are you kidding me? I got to 8,000. I got to 8,000. Oh my goodness. I got to let my dog into my room or he's going to go insane. I'll be right back in a couple seconds. Goodness. Oh my goodness. My doggo is wondering what I'm doing. He's so confused. I miss you, buddy. I'm going crazy in here without you. But I love you. Please, sit over there. I have to sit in the middle. Please, move your butt. Please. Okay. You're just gonna lay down there, huh? Good. Stop it! Pick a place to lay down and lay down. And stay there. Subscribe! Buddy! Why are you doing this? Okay. Back to business. I'm bored out of my mind. Like, you have to understand, in order to do this, you have to be bored out of your mind. Oh my goodness gracious. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. The dog realizes how boring I am. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My gosh. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My goodness gracious. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 dude. Dude, subscribe, dude. Dude, subscribe, dude. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. 6 people are watching. I hope all 6 of you are subscribed. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please subscribe. All I want you to do is subscribe. Just subscribe. Just please subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My dog thinks that I'm actually going insane. Can you see him? You can barely even see him in the light there. Mod, please. I don't know what that means. Subscribe, 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 please. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh, I'm at. Whoa. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Of course I'm still going. I don't know what the moderator does. I don't think it really does anything. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Of course I'm still going. You thought I'd quit? I'm not a quitter. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. Oh, okay. I thought the audio had cut out or something. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. That has happened to me before. I did something for like 2 hours straight. I was like, oh my god, this is going to be such a great video. And then I realized I wasn't recording, and I was so mad. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. If I did that here, like, gosh. If I said it all 10,000 times without recording, dude, Ugh, 10,000. I said 10,000 and counted. Subscribe. I don't know why I did that. But there's 7 people watching. That's one less than my most. I hope you're all subscribed. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. I'm sorry, I can't add any of your chat subscribes. Only me saying it. Sorry, that's just how it is. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. That would be terrible. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe.
Hey, bud. It's okay. It's okay, bud. Don't worry. Don't you worry about it.
You're on the internet, buddy. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay, that's enough, doggo. Who needs him? I need you. I love you both. I love you. You know what else I would love? If you would subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please subscribe. I know you're at a wedding, Mitch. Please just get up on the stage and just be like, subscribe to Talk Later on YouTube. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ooh, my goodness gracious. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. No. Well, I thought I reset it. Oh my gosh, I am so happy. I clicked the thing under it and it took me to a different page. Oh, I thought I reset that. Dude, no, it's okay. I didn't, but gosh, that was close, dude. That was terrifying. I thought I'd have to say subscribe 10,000 times all over again. Oh my gosh. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I don't know why either of you are watching this. This is just weird, dude. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I mean, I'm not complaining. I'm glad that you're watching, but honestly, it's weird. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Please, all of you, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Fine, fine. Look, look, look. I'll count down. 1, boom, and then I'll go from there. Okay. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. Bodhi keeps looking at me weird. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my goodness gracious. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I think I should too. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. This is subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I can't read the whole chat because Mitch was here. He decided to type everything that came through his mind, which, believe it or not, is a lot. That's really, I like ResK. He's funny. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh no. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'm sorry. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. This is actually insane. Why did I do this? But I can do this. I can do it. I believe in myself, guys. Subscribe, subscribe. I said it twice without a counting, okay? So I'm going to click it twice. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Surely this isn't the weirdest thing on the internet. Surely not. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Fine, fine. Down one. Subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe. Fine. Fine. I'll just, no, I won't. Oh, that was terrifying. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. 700 more. Dude. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I promise I make more funny, interesting, and not boring videos. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 dude. 600 more. And I'm almost to 3 hours. This is actually nuts. My back is killing me. The cool thing is, though, since I didn't expect anyone to continue watching for this long, I probably added like 9 hours to my watch time. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My mom said I can do it. Keep going. Dude, I have to do it now. There's no way I'm not doing it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. My mom said something in the chat. That's amazing. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I will do it, Mom. I'll do it for you. And so that people subscribe. That's the other reason I'm doing it. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh, subscribe, 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 subscribe. 500 more. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. And I'm really hungry. I'm also really hungry. What time is it? It's 5:30, dude. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. This is more of a workout than track. More of a workout than track. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. No, thank you. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. I'll be done soon. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Oh my goodness gracious. This is, I mean, no thanks, guys. I'll be done soon. I'll do it. All I want you to do is subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Ah, my goodness gracious. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Buddy is still here. He's just chilling. He has totally accepted how weird I am. Don't do that. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. No, thank you. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Just please, please subscribe. Please subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, subscribe, please don't. Subscribe, subscribe, so please. Please do subscribe. I was saying please don't to the chat. I do want you to subscribe. I want you to subscribe. Subscribe, please subscribe. Please do subscribe. Do subscribe. Do that. Subscribe. Goodness. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Just subscribe. Just subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh, subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh, there's 6 people watching. Oh, please, please, new people, if you are actually new, just please subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Oh my gosh. This is insane. I have only 100 left, dude. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Please subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Thank you so much. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. To those of you who have been here since like 100. I know Cody has been here for quite a while. If he is still here, he might have actually left, maybe. But if he hasn't, he's been here for quite a while. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. subscribe. Oh my gosh, this is about to happen, guys. I mean, honestly, just subscribe. I mean, subscribe. Never mind. I'm too tired. I'm just gonna leave it. I'm good. See ya. I'm just kidding. Please subscribe. I did all this. All I want you to do is subscribe. Oh my god.